Have you ever found an item in Hollow Knight and just thought, I wish that were actually a new ability? Wait, that did nothing? Gross? Wow, I don't care.
Did I just do the entire Hunter's Journal for nothing?
You and me both, buddy. We need to talk about Hollow Knight's progression. Games with permanent progression like Hollow Knight face a surprising number of design challenges. Let's go through some of the biggest ones and see how Hollow Knight handles them. We'll start with challenge number 1. The cool rewards need to come early. A complaint you might have heard before, or even made yourself, is that there is no gameplay reward for beating Path of Pain, or completing the Hunter's Journal, or doing anything in Godhome. On the face of it, that sounds pretty insane. The hardest challenges in the entire game have no substantial rewards for beating them. That's like finding a cure for cancer and getting rewarded with a pat on the back. Almost like an unspoken rule, the further you get into Hollow Knight, the less impressive the rewards become. Think about it. At the start to mid-game, you're collecting spells, the Mothwing Cloak, Mantis Claw, and a little later on the Monarch Wings. Game-changing abilities with huge impact on combat and exploration. Amazing rewards, but after the Shade Cloak, you've basically collected all the cool treasures. The next many hours of exploration might amount to little more than a charm for collecting all the grubs, and a soul vessel fragment here and there. You've still got a few nail upgrades to collect, but each one takes increasingly more pale ore, which is effectively the same as the reward getting less impressive over time. And once you finally make it to the very end of the game, the well of rewards has run completely dry. Grasping for any means of progression, you spend hours turning your fragile charms unbreakable, one of which makes no economic sense, and the other two of which you're only ever using in Godhome, where they can't break anyway. The unbreakable charms are basically no more than cosmetic changes. You've officially gone completely insane. But why? Why does the game do this? Is it a design oversight? No, I don't think so. Here's why. As I see it, collectibles are tools more than rewards in and of themselves. Scavenging for upgrades for your character is almost like playing an extended tutorial. Upgrades reward exploration, push you to continue playing, and make you feel more powerful as time goes on. And as you slowly acquire new abilities, you're essentially funneled into the most engaging and decision-rich part of the game, playing with all of the spells, charms, and movement abilities unlocked. At that point, you're almost looking for the challenge, not the reward. Or put another way, the challenge itself becomes the reward. That's why most of the core abilities, the cool rewards, have to come early. Because all things equal, the game is more engaging with the Mothwing Cloak, Mantis Claw, and Monarch Wings. And if you kept those upgrades from the player until the very end, you would be depriving them of hours of fun adventuring with those abilities in play. But there's another related issue here. Challenge number 2. High-level rewards exclude. If you gave out a reward for completing the Path of Pain, you would essentially prevent 90% of players from ever getting that reward. And while that might be alright for some rewards, you really have to be cautious about which treasures you keep the majority of players from being able to unlock. I recently played the Pale Court mod, and it has this insanely difficult Path of Pain type challenge that rewards you with a charm at the end. I won't spoil what the charm does, but it's pretty damn cool. And unsurprisingly, I've heard people complain that they'll never be able to acquire the charm legitimately because they just can't beat the challenge. I find that kind of frustration quite understandable. So again, that's an argument against rewarding players immensely for completing the toughest challenges. But is there any reward you can give for an accomplishment like completing Path of Pain? The game already gives you some lore, which is a relatively safe price. Although on the other hand, people have complained about not being able to get the hardest ending to the game, completing Pantheon 5, and having to look it up on the internet instead. So again, it's tough. What else? You could give out an achievement, or you could reward the player with an even harder challenge as the reward itself. Personally, I think the best reward for completing something like Path of Pain is actually just being able to say that you've done it. All in all, I do think Hollow Knight does late game rewards pretty damn well. If you're committed enough to beat Pantheon 5, you probably enjoy playing the game just for the sake of playing it. At least, I hope so. Here is perhaps the biggest challenge to making fun progression without breaking your entire game. But first, let me take just 9 seconds to tell you that I'm releasing a Hollow Knight video every day for 7 days straight with a great surprise at the end, so consider subscribing, you don't want to miss this. Thank you so much. Challenge number 3. Power discrepancy breaks everything. Let me expand on that a little. Power discrepancy refers to the difference in combat power between two players. So that might be one player having a stronger nail or better movement abilities than another player. 3 questions emerge. Does Hollow Knight have high or low power discrepancy? What's the problem with a high power discrepancy? And what's the problem with a low power discrepancy? First, all things considered, I think Hollow Knight has a relatively low power discrepancy. That means when you finish a 20-hour run and go back to the start, you won't feel that much weaker even though you're all the way back at the beginning. Sure, you'll need certain items and abilities to reach certain bosses, but once you do, you can most likely defeat that boss regardless of your current loadout. Depending on how long you want to spend trying, that is. Now, the fact that it is possible to beat, say, the final boss with only 2 or 3 abilities and no permanent upgrades is really good. Crucial, actually. Because that means the game has a low power discrepancy. And let me tell you why you would not want a high power discrepancy in Hollow Knight. Okay, so let's consider Hornet Protector and Soulmaster. 2 bosses which most players will be fighting in relatively close succession. According to the wiki, Hornet has 225 health, while Soulmaster has 385 health. Alright, so now consider that instead of having roughly 50% more health than Hornet, Soulmaster had 200% more health, 3 times as much. That's essentially a high power discrepancy, and if that were actually the case, it would pretty much be impossible for a new player to fight Soulmaster without getting some sort of upgrade first. Now, in this alternative high discrepancy universe, we would likely see many more combat-oriented permanent upgrades. So, before fighting Soulmaster, you might be expected to first go collect a few nail upgrades and some additional masks. It would almost not be optional, but essential. So what's the problem? Well, firstly, it would force you into a very narrow style of play. Because of the low discrepancy that Hollow Knight currently boasts, after getting Mantis Claw, you can basically explore the entire map right then and there. With high discrepancy, that might not be possible. You would be required to grind for certain raw power upgrades before facing specific bosses. And some areas, even if you could reach them, would effectively be off limits because they would be too hard to explore without upgrades. In summary, you would be forced to grind, and the world would feel smaller and less open. Other issues may include feeling way too powerful coming back to old areas, as well as having a hard time in general finding the right enemies or bosses to fight. With a high discrepancy, you would constantly be running the risk of going to an area that was not made for your current level. If you're having trouble envisioning a high discrepancy Hollow Knight, you can think of another high discrepancy game, World of Warcraft. As a low-level character, you simply cannot venture through specific areas in World of Warcraft because the enemies will be way too powerful for you to tackle them. And that's because all the upgrades and levels and high damage numbers means a level 1 player in World of Warcraft is worlds apart from a level 60 player. Which is not the case in Hollow Knight, at least not to the same degree. So alright, we get it, Holland, we don't want a high discrepancy. But is there a problem then with the reverse? How Hollow Knight does it? Is there a problem with having low power discrepancy? Yes, there is. Here's the main issue. You're really limited in what upgrades you can give the player. If you think about World of Warcraft, the fun part of that game is that you have dozens, if not hundreds of unique abilities for every class. You're constantly leveling up, getting more powerful, unlocking new abilities, picking up shiny loot. That's the benefit of a high discrepancy power system. In Hollow Knight, the loot is far less impressive. A lot of it doesn't even do anything by itself. But that has to be so, or the game wouldn't be able to sustain a low power discrepancy. Because that's essentially what a low power discrepancy is, a lack of impressive loot. So let's talk about the problem with that. Challenge number 4. Non-essential loot has to feel meaningful. Non-essential loot is shorthand for loot that doesn't contribute majorly to the player's power level. The game needs this non-essential loot to guide the player and reward exploration. But to avoid creating high discrepancy, such rewards can't be too powerful. So the design challenge is creating rewards that feel impressive without actually being so. And that's hard. Ori and the Blind Forest has a relatively low power discrepancy, but in my opinion, the game isn't very good at hiding how insignificant its rewards really are. In Ori, enemies drop experience points, but no more than an hour into the game, it becomes so painfully clear how completely insignificant this experience is to collect. It essentially has no effect on your experience bar once you get to a certain point, because the game can't give away all of its upgrades so early on. Which, in my opinion, is a great example of why a low discrepancy game like Ori should be very careful not to hand out too many rewards. So what does Hollow Knight do? Well, it gives you mask shards, which have no effect on their own. You need 4 shards to gain 1 extra pip of health, but those first 3 shards have 0 effect on gameplay whatsoever. That's the sacrifice you have to make to remain low discrepancy. But unlike Ori, Hollow Knight rarely makes a promise it can't deliver on. Even Geo, which is the closest Hollow Knight gets to Ori's yellow essence, feels impactful up until the mid to late game. You can actually buy something with Geo collected from enemies. Now sure, by the end of the game, not unlike Ori, you don't care very much about picking up 1 or 2 Geo rocks, and that's a valid criticism. But again, that's the cost you pay for having a measured resource, like a currency, in a low discrepancy game. It can't be used to buy anything too powerful. However, there's one part of Hollow Knight's progression system that really manages to make non-essential loot feel meaningful. And that's the charm system. Because the beautiful trick with charms is that you can make them pretty powerful without stepping on the toes of low discrepancy progression. Why? Well, because you actually have to equip the charm to use it, unlike Ori's upgrades, which are permanent. So when you find a new charm, you might not actually get any stronger. But it feels like that, or at least it feels cool to find a new charm. You want to try it on, see what it does, you're adding it to your ever-growing collection, which feels satisfying. All that makes charms a perfect non-essential reward. So given what you have to sacrifice for your game to retain a low discrepancy power curve, I actually think Hollow Knight does really well to still present you with dozens of rewards that feel meaningful. The only consideration I have is this one. Would Hollow Knight be better if, instead of every mask shard giving no benefit, they instead gave a very slight benefit? See, that kind of micro adjustment is possible in a game like World of Warcraft, where you can have an attack deal 100 damage or 101 damage, but in Hollow Knight, the numbers are quite low, which I am a huge fan of. That does mean, however, that it's hard to give the player a fourth of a mask as a reward. Though I don't know whether I like that idea even in theory. It might take away something from getting that 4th mask if you're receiving a reward every step along the way. But I wanted to bring it up anyway. So let me know what you think down in the comments below about any of the challenges I've presented or about Hollow Knight's progression as a whole. Do you like it? Do you not? What other games have done it better or worse? I'm looking forward to reading your comments. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you liked the video and want to see more in the future. And again, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the topic of progression as a whole and whether I missed anything big. But that's all for now. Stay tuned for the next 3 days of consecutive uploads, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Goodbye!